After we spoke to Erin Pizzey about her history of setting up the refuges and what happened to that project, we then had a conversation with her about the therapeutic element that she brought into the refuge when she first set them up, and what is now not available in the refuge movement but is much needed. Erin, you were saying that when you first set up the refuges, you created a therapeutic community. That you recognised there was a need for therapy for people, and I think that's probably something that's lacking now in the refuge movement. That therapeutic community approach
Well,
has
yes,
been
because
lost.
yeah, because naively, when oh, that was her name, Sandra Hawley, was in
Mm.
the wings to take over from my refuge. So when she was appointed, um, I wrote to her and said, anything I can do to help. And I explained, the therapeutic need for some of the women in the refuge. She wrote back a very terse little note that simply said there's no need for women to have any form of therapy because men are the problem, women are the victims. So that,
So that's the logic of it. They don't need
yes, it is.
therapy.
No, no.
But your
And
experience is different from that.
oh,
You could see something different.
well, yes, because I'd always had a great interest in therapy.
Mm.
Uh, there was a period of time when I lived in Cornwall and I was on my own a lot because my ex-husband was in the Navy, and the local bus would come round with the library books, and I just read a huge amount of Jung and Freud and all sorts of books. And then I had an experience with a young, well, I suppose the only thing you could call him was probably a sociopath, and I came across um, Maxwell Jones' work. He was the first person to set up a therapeutic community in a hospital setting in Henderson. Have you
Yeah.
heard of him?
Yes, yes, of course.
Fascinating, absolutely
Yes,
fascinating.
yes.
And Peter, who was the person I was getting involved with, I sent him there to the Henderson Hospital, and it made a huge difference to his life.
Right.
And
That was a brave experiment to set up the Henderson unit
it was
because,
wonderful, wonderful. And
but you're handing authority over to the people who have the problems. They start to run it
well,
within absolute
that's
limits.
exactly the model I used. So
Mm.
because I had a lot of experience in that women's the headquarters of the women's liberation, I realised very quickly knowledge is power. So they used to fight over who answered the phone. The answer then in a therapeutic setting is nobody answers the phone except the people who pay the rent. So that means
Right.
none of the staff, none of the volunteers, no one can sit behind the desk and run it, the day to day, except the people who pay the rent. So no
Right.
one could get behind and then create a staff them and us situation. There was no them and us. It's us. And nobody could be voted out of the community except by the community.
And being allowed in is under the same rules. Just
No,
you
anybody
can't
could
come
come
in.
in. Yes, there was no anybody could come in. Nobody was screened. They came in, and then within a matter of days. But in fact, because for the first time in those women's lives, many of them violence prone or whatever, they come into a place that it wasn't an institution. They weren't being judged. It was a warm, loving community, full of men and women of goodwill, women who were living there and the volunteers who came in. And it was extraordinary. There was a wonderful feeling. And I used to say the Shekhinah is there, the shining face of God, because the motto was, you love the unlovable. Because how can you love if you've never been loved?
Mm.
And that was so true of so many of the women and the children coming in. And it was certainly true in my case. My mother hated me. She said I was born to be hanged.
Good
And I
Lord.
was a very, very violent child. The violence in the family was from her to me particularly, because I looked like my father, and she hated him. And she would never leave him because he was a consul in his time and she had big houses and servants. and she was never going to give up that lifestyle. So I knew all about his violence was verbal and bullying, but hers was lethal. She used to whip me with an ironing cord. So it's a perfect background to run a refuge.
Well, it certainly means you're not afraid of what could happen,
No,
because you've seen it all. Yeah.
seen it all, and actually, what I know very securely is that violent people are frightened people. And the most important thing is not to push them into a place where they have to do something violent. That applies to children as well. And I was to say to people going to the door when the men came to the door, don't stand there with the chain on. All I need you to do is, when he's there, walk down the steps, because he won't come up the steps. It was too imposing and too frightening. I said, and put your hand on his shoulder or his arm and just say, I'm sorry this is happening to you. And then sit down together on the bottom step and talk about it. And the only one time I did use a chain was this lovely, lovely mum with about 6 kids. They were from Jamaica. And she pointed out that he used to carry a machete in his long coat like this. And he came up on the doorstep and he was standing like that. And I was busy with the chain on, talking to him. And you could hear, these are my jade bracelets, rattling furiously. And I was shaking. I was scared. But, it's meeting people at a human level, and we've forgotten how to do that.
But you have people who have had traumatic childhood experiences which may have shaped their behaviour as an adult, and then you have other people whose adult experiences have put them into a situation which they can't cope with any longer. So you have very different needs amongst different people.
Well, that's the two things that I could see from the very, very beginning. It was women who had come from warm, loving families and by accident got into a violent relationship. They didn't need long-term therapeutic care. They needed refuge. They needed legal advice. They needed to be rehoused with their children, but they could cope. The women that needed us were the women who were victims of their own childhood violence and dysfunction, who had histories going back several generations. And that's where I was beginning to learn, because I knew from my own family, both sides, that there was alcoholism and violence of both fathers, and some of the mothers who were very violent. So I had a violent history, so I understood it.
And then, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Yeah, go on.
No, go on. No, you go.
Okay, what I was going to say was that of course people get into relationships where they're both violent. In other words, because they're familiar with that kind of relationship, and it becomes like at home for them to have a partner who's...
people always think of violent relationships as being, women being women, but it's both women and men being regularly beaten up and terrible scenes. It's not like that. Violent people have this. They'll have periods when it's the honeymoon period, when they're sorry, and anybody who's violent can change, because what I knew about and I taught very early on was your strategies for survival. Now, as a child, my strategy for survival was violence, and it was effective for me. My twin sisters' strategies were to withdraw. She'd end up imploding, so she had the migraines and various rashes and all these kinds of symptoms of the violence.
So could you protect yourself against your mother by being violent?
I was never violent. I was too frightened of her. No, I couldn't. But I. The only time as an adult I was violent, and very violent, because I have a stick. Because my walking isn't very good. It was a long time ago now. It was a man attacking somebody I loved. He'd floored him, and so I beat him. I'm very calm, because I'm very, like a lot of violent people, I know my limits. I've always explained violence. It's like, if you stretch some elastic, it won't go back. It'll always have those little stretch marks in it. So you have to learn how to deal with that anger. And that comes into the strategies for survival. If the strategy for survival is violence, well, that means that the moment you're frustrated or upset, you go from violence, from frustration, straight to rage. Now, how do you learn the in-between bits? And the first thing is that people who come from violent backgrounds, particularly their childhoods, they don't know compassion and pity and sorrow. Those families don't actually break down and cry and say, this hurts, you're hurting me. They hit each other. So it was getting relationships in the refuge with the mothers who were violent that was trusting enough that they could learn to explore their emotions.
So it's just to have that space between frustration and violence where people can learn something.
And they learn that the outcome can be harmonious if you do it that way. And
So you're not doing away with frustration, you actually work with the frustration.
Well, yes, I mean, how frustrating to be in a building with something like 60 or 70 mothers and children. But it has its advantage, because what I learned very early on is that you need space to organise rage. And we had a lot more trouble when we had a big squat and taken out 28 mothers and children. And suddenly women would start creating their own areas and spaces and defend their territory. Whereas when it was packed, the intermingling of everybody, you couldn't actually get very cross, because some kid's going to come up and put a sticky hand on you, or someone's going to hand you a cigarette. Everybody smoked in those days. And
so if there was something to fight over, which was space, then people would fight.
yes, well, exactly. So space, you can organise rage, but if you're packed together, it's probably why, the fights don't break out on underground, because it's packed. No, but it's something I realised very early on, and it's interesting that as soon as we emptied out, that's when women were likely to go back. Now, it's a difficult thing to explain to people, what I call therapeutic chaos, because when the house is absolutely packed, it worked at its best. Everybody moving in together, helping each other, being involved with each other, sleeping in dormitories, creating very, very good friendships, because that's the first time for many women, because if you're in a violent relationship, the one thing that the violent man will do is make sure you don't have any friends, or the woman will do that to men. Make sure you don't have any friends, you don't have any acquaintances. We could never ask anybody back to our house, because my father was too frightening. So I understood that. So there you are, you're sharing the dormitories, you're supporting each other, you're making firm relationships, which was lovely, because then when, in the refuge, the crisis refuge, I kept it at a crisis. Well, it was a crisis anyway, because there was nowhere else to go. So it was always packed. But then as we learned to squat and moved out our communities, we owned streets in Notting Hill Gate at one point, and the big therapeutic community in Palm Court. And then we had what I call second stages. And second stage is where we would squat a house with 4 or 5 mums and kids. So you're still supported, you've still got your friends with you. And then after, when the time usually took 2 or 3 years, that you got your legitimate housing, you've seeded out into the area. I had a very good house in Bristol that I worked in a lot of the time. And then the Bristol mamas would be moved into Bristol, but they'd still have the central house in Bristol to go back to, make friends with, and all the rest of it. And the promise to every woman that came in is that if she messed up, if she got herself in another violent relationship, she could always come back to the refuge and start again.
How long do you think it takes people to turn their lives around? Do you think it is about 2 or 3 years, or is it, obviously it varies, you can't generalise about everybody.
What I would say, it varies. I would say that younger women who've only been in a violent relations for 3 or 4 years, provided they recognise and can make the changes, so they don't immediately go back into finding themselves in another violent relationship. See, this is the thing. Women would come in and say to me, he's violent, he does this and he does that. I said, but that's him. Right? I accept he's violent. Why did you choose him? That's the question. Isn't it?
Quite a challenge for them to answer, I imagine.
And quite a lot of women do go back to a violent partner as well.
Oh gosh, yes. That's the thing with the refuge. Is I've got the original register from the refuge. So you can see, as you look at it, who went home, who went where, all of it. Yes, and my argument with the women's movement and the way it's run, that one of the problems is that they just have a revolving door. So she comes into the refuge. The refuge is then used often as time out from the relationship. So when he's sorry enough, back she goes. And that isn't the answer. The answer is she needs to set up and trust and find herself in a position where she's going to make the choice not to go back. Because she has a life. She has other things she can do.
But that takes time, doesn't it, to learn that?
Of course it takes time. And you see, there's no light in Chiswick, there's no time limit on how you stay. You only move when you want to. Some women stayed in the crisis refuge for a very long time. And also, this is going to sound odd, but having been in a boarding school and a holiday home, because my parents were abroad, I understood institutional care. But I also understood the idea of boarding schools who after all produce enormously successful, wealthy, whatever. That ethos of a boarding school where you actually create your prefects who actually do, it automatically happened because as the women were running it, the more responsible women who wanted the bigger roles actually became the prefects. And then quite naturally the older mothers who'd been there longer mothered the younger mothers or the new mothers coming in.
So it kind of creates itself in a way. That
it does. It's a running therapeutic community, and the people coming in, the new women coming in, create this. It's almost its own internal drama, but instead of the violence of the drama, and violent drama, it's healthy, bonding, calm drama. The one and only rule that the women made is that no violence, no physical violence. And one in the refuge, and there was only ever one case. And what happens at 10 o'clock in the morning, everything that happened, if there's arguments or because they were always discussed in full for as long as it took.
10 o'clock meeting.
Yeah, and that's.
But you might have 30 or 40 people in the meeting, mightn't you? Or you might have be a huge meeting.
Yeah, a huge meeting, but everybody it's what. They were meeting anyway, they were living there anyway.
But it's massively powerful, isn't it, to have comment from 30 or 40 people on what you're doing and how you're behaving.
Well, that's the only way it's going to work, because an awful lot of those women have come not only from violent backgrounds, but many of them from prisons, many of them from care homes. And, I mean, at one point, because people were having difficulty, a lot of the people, in expressing feelings, we read poetry together. And all the mothers had little books, and they wrote their own poetry. The poetry is the best way for people who don't have much vocabulary.
What do you think helped you to deal with it from your own experience? Because you didn't have a therapeutic community to go into. You didn't have a refuge.
I think probably what it was I had utter faith in God. I knew whatever was happening to me, and however painful it was, that at some point it would be a purpose. I passionately believe, having been at the holiday home, where Miss Williams treated us rather like puppies, so 40 girls and boys were allowed to do whatever they liked. There was the boys section where they had their workshop, which by the way barred females, which was very irritating. But all of us, we lived together from the ages of 9, most of us till 16, because in those days a lot of parents were abroad. And it was really St Mary's as a model, because we had to make all our own arrangements. There was no television, and interact with each other. And I naturally looked after I used to help bath the babies. The littlest ones were Dora and Goldie. They're from the Gold Coast. Their father was the financial minister. Awful, those two little girls. Can you imagine? They were so young. And then, and a lot of the children, they might see their parents once every 3 years. So that's really where my model came from. And all that Miss Williams, Pop would be there for the meals. She'd actually sit in her sitting room, her drawing room, it was in those days. And every night you could go and say good night to her. You stood there, you said, "Good night, Miss Williams." She had a massive box of chocolates in front of her. She was feeding her face. And that's the only really time that you'd ever say anything to her.
Was there anybody else running it? It sounds like the...
Mostly her, and then she had Miss Baker, who we were absolutely horrible to.
Right.
But no, she was 6'7".
Right.
Good Lord.
Yeah.
She was my model actually, 6'7", across, and she was a golfing champion, and she drove ambulances during the war.
Right.
And I
Right.
would look at this woman, and I thought, when I was only 9, and nobody
gonna be like
could
that.
do anything. That was my model, my mentor. So you
Right.
find that in the refuge with the men particularly, they'd
Yeah.
mentor.
Yeah.
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 So you would say that what you did, the therapeutic community approach is the way forward, Erin. I'm trying to think about what Women's Aid and Refuge, what would their method, or how would you describe them? Is it just the provision of accommodation,
No,
or is
But I know, because basically the ideology is that the women are victims. Therefore, they've no need, as she said, as Sandra Hawley said to me, there's no need for therapy. They're victims. Therefore, men are the problem, and the women are victims in the refuge. And essentially, they're hostels, yes.
Yes.
And they will certainly have staff, mostly to deal with the rehousing and whatever. But they're not therapeutic communities, no. But that is needed. But then, on the other hand, if you're going to screen everybody and not take anybody in who's a problem, then it's not going to be a refuge so much, is it? It will be a hostel.
Mm.
Mm. It seems like an easy option from my perspective, because the way that you're talking is a difficult one. It's I'm not in any way critical of it. I'm meaning it requires effort. It requires
gosh, yes. It requires, but the reward of seeing women and children just blossom.
Of course.
It was fantastic. It was worth all the effort.
Yeah.
And the sadness is that because they have the psychological ideology, they can't see women as human beings. They can only see women as victims, and that's so hurtful. Because as far as I'm concerned, until it means that a woman can't be human. And so often women will just, I'm so ashamed. You say, but you've got nothing to be ashamed of. Well, yes, but as a woman and a mother. So, but why does that make you different to men? People have problems. It's perfectly all right. And that's the sad part of it all. We're not. If you run them as hostels with staff who just deal with the basics, you don't change anything.
No.
Yes, you help a percentage of the women coming in, but not the women that most need it. They won't get in, and if they get in, they'll be evicted fairly quickly.
And I suppose it would be reasonable to say that if they didn't go home to their partners who are abusive, that they might leave that partner, but the next man that they get involved with would be another abuser, probably.
Well, yes, and this is why I was so insistent on a second stage house, because you've got a woman in a crisis refuge. She's learned a huge amount about herself, but she's still very, very vulnerable. And you put her, she's rehoused eventually. A lot of them went on to estates, and then you've got men, predatory men, sculling around, who will hone in on her. Because she's lonely and she's needy, and that's why you need that second stage house. So you have a support system that runs right the way through. Because without it, people are, and God knows, I've been a single parent mother. It isn't a role I'd ask on anybody, and particularly trying to bring up a son on your own when the son's much bigger than you are, and is not at all interested in being told what to do by a woman, even if it's his mother. So you can see the need for men in the refuges, for the little girls, their dads aren't a safe pair of arms, and they learn that these men are.
And that's the only relationship with a man they may have had until they reach an age where they start having relationships themselves.
With the men who are like their dads.
Yeah, of course.
It's always said, isn't it? Men tend to marry their mothers. Well, there you go.
Yeah. Erin, I think we've exhausted you. Thank you very much for speaking so much and telling us so much.
Wonderful to talk to you, Erin. I hope we can do it again.
Yes. Well,
Thank you very much.